Good morning, Hope Community Church. How are you feeling? If you have your Bibles, you go ahead and open up to the Gospel of Luke. If you're just joining us, we've been walking through this gospel together over about the entire summer together. And you can go ahead and open to chapter 23. But today's sermon is going to look a little bit different because I don't want to look just at one portion of the passage here in the Gospel of Luke. I want to look at the entirety of an event that's taking place. Today, I want us to look at the 6 trials that Jesus went through here in Luke chapters 22 and 23. In case we haven't met yet, my name's Kenny. I'm one of the teaching pastors here at Hope Community Church, and I haven't been here for a little while for good reason, and that's because just over 5 weeks ago, our son Fletcher was born as me and Rachel's first child. Thank you. We're very excited that he's here. But also the day that he came had to have been one of the scariest days of my entire life. And just real quick, it was Thursday, June 23rd. Rachel, she had been preparing herself. She'd been training her body. She's the most self-willed person I've ever met in my life. She's so determined, and she'd been preparing herself to attempt an all-natural birth. She was planning for it. She was preparing for it. She was doing so well. And Thursday, June 23rd comes, she goes in for a regularly scheduled midwife appointment at 2 o'clock. By 4 o'clock, they say that her blood pressure is just a little bit high, so they send her over to the hospital, Catawba Valley Medical Center, for routine observation. When we get there, blood pressure evened out. They said her blood work was perfect. They've never seen hemoglobin levels so good in a pregnant woman. I don't know what that means. They explained it to me. I still don't know what it means, but it sounds good. She'd been doing everything right, taking care of herself so well. Then they tell us that it's a mandatory 4-hour stay, so we're going to be going home at 8:30. I was like, all right, well, this is a money racket, but whatever, we'll be going home. Then about 7 o'clock, me and Rachel are discussing what we're going to eat for dinner because we're starving at this point. And then the midwife comes in and says, what do you think about an induction? Have this baby tonight. I said, no, that's not the plan. We don't want to do that. And then she informs us that our baby's heart rate's dropping every once in a while. She's not sure why. So we need to order IV and an ultrasound. So an hour and a half later, a lady comes in with an ultrasound, proceeds to do a 30-minute ultrasound, doesn't say a single word the entire time, and it's obvious that he's not moving in the womb. And we don't know what's going on. So she leaves the room. And about 9:30, now a surgeon walks in and says, what do you think about doing a C-section? We said, no, we don't want induction. We don't want to do a C-section. He said, well, you scored too low on the ultrasound. You're not going home tonight. And we're afraid that your baby will not be able to tolerate the labor pains, the labor contractions, because his heart rate keeps dropping every once in a while. So we need to continue to monitor that, but you guys need to make a decision. And so that's when I called the baby whisperer herself, Jenna Allen, and she walked me through every single scenario, and I just asked her straight up, I said, is the safest thing for Rachel and the baby if we just go ahead and ultrasound? She said yes. And so that's when the world began to cave in on me then. And then at 10:06, the surgeon comes in and says his heart rate's dropping even lower. He's having trouble breathing according to our monitors, and we're not going to know why until we get him out, so we need a decision now. And I said, okay, well, go ahead with the ultrasound. Now, when's this going to happen? He said, you'll have your baby in your arms in 30 minutes. And that's when I really started to panic. Okay, I had to go to the car, get all the bags. It's a 4-story building. I got off on the wrong floor twice. I don't know how that works, but and I get up there, and then so they take Rachel back to prep her at 10:06, and by 10:38, Fletcher was in our arms. It happened so fast. And praise God, he was completely healthy. Rachel was healthy. Placenta levels were low, and so everything was okay. And we have a healthy boy who's growing very rapidly because he eats a lot. Now, I share that with you to start today because, we knew he was coming. Okay, we prepared the best way that we knew how for his coming, but whenever that time came, it was nothing like we had planned for. It came very fast, it was chaotic, and the process was absolutely terrifying. And I felt like that gave us a little bit of insight to what the disciples kind of experienced here in this one night here that we see in Luke chapter 22 and 23. Because they knew Jesus was the Messiah. They knew that he was going to fulfill his messiahship and usher in a new era. But whenever that time came, it was nothing like they had planned for. It happened very fast. It was chaotic, and the process was absolutely terrifying. So let's set the scene. At the beginning of Luke chapter 22, we see that the Passover festivities had begun in the city of Jerusalem. Verse 1 of Luke 22 says, "Now the feast of unleavened bread drew near," which is called Passover. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to put Jesus to death, for they feared the people. Now, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or more famously referred to as the Passover, was the 7-day celebration that's the largest national holiday among the Jewish people. And now, at this point in time in history, the city of Jerusalem normally had a population of about 400,000 people. But most scholars agree that during Passover week at this time, there would be about 2.5 million people in town for the celebration. This was a huge holiday. But at this point in time, it was also a time of great tension and unrest. Because what are they celebrating during the Passover? Mainly the Exodus from Egypt. They're celebrating their history when God delivered them from being ruled by a foreign nation. This holiday is all about freedom. And now this would lead to unrest because they're celebrating freedom while being ruled by a foreign nation. Therefore, the Roman Empire, they would need to up their security during this time because they would need to squash any rebellions or insurrections that might arise. They already recently had to put one out where a man named Barabbas tried to lead his own rebellion and murdered a few people in the process, and now he's currently in custody. This is why Pilate, the governor of Judea, had to be in town during this because he might be needed at a moment's notice. And now within this time of tension, Jesus, he had already been stirring the pot. Jesus, he had already publicly called out the religious leaders time and time again for their hypocrisy and greed. He had turned over the tables in the temple, drove out the vendors who were ripping people off. So the local priests in town, they then spent almost all of chapter 20 trying to find ways, catch him in his word so they can accuse him of something, arrest him, and get rid of him. They're trying to put him to death. And then they finally found their way. In verses 3 and 6 of chapter 22, we're told that Judas, he went to the religious leaders and agreed to find a way to get Jesus into their custody for the right price whenever no one else was around. Meanwhile, later in the chapter, we see that Jesus and his disciples, they had partaken of the Last Supper together, and then they make their way to the Mount of Olives. And along the way, the disciples, they're just arguing among themselves about who's the greatest among them, who's going to have the highest positions whenever Jesus ushers in his new kingdom. They don't seem to have a care in the world. And they're so comfortable that whenever they get to the Mount of Olives, Jesus, he goes away to pray, and they just fall asleep. And then at one point, Jesus wakes them up and says, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray so you won't enter into temptation." And then at that moment, they hear some commotion off in the distance. They look and they see a dim glow. The flickering keeps getting brighter and brighter to the point that they realize that that glow is the flickering of torches. Then they hear footsteps getting louder and louder to the point where it sounds like marching. And this is when it begins to get out of hand for the disciples and chaotic, because before they know it, they are surrounded by this large, heavily armed crowd. Consisted of some of the most prominent religious figures among them. They were highly trained temple guards with clubs and swords and torches, and Judas, their friend, is leading them. And John 18:3 says Judas had procured a band of soldiers. That word band literally meant a military cohort that consisted of 600 troops. So they felt the need to send 600 soldiers to go arrest one man who only had 11 guys with him as backup. Well, their concerns turned out to be valid because John goes on to tell us what happened whenever they came to arrest Jesus. One of my favorite stories in all of Scripture. John 18:4-6 says, "Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, 'Who do you seek?' They answered him, 'Jesus of Nazareth.' And then Jesus said to them, 'I am he.' When Jesus said to them, 'I am he,' they drew back and fell to the ground." Now, there's some speculation to what that really means. They drew back and fell to the ground. But if you go back to the original language and break this down word by word or phrase by phrase, it could literally be translated, when Jesus said to them, "I am he," they were sent off flying back and thrusted into the earth. Now that would have been a sight to see. 600 troops being knocked off of their feet by the power of Jesus merely declaring his identity and who he is. 3 words knocking them all to the earth. No doubt that's why Peter was full of confidence. So full of confidence that he felt comfortable enough to pull out his sword even though they were outnumbered 50-1 and try to fight them. Wouldn't you be that confident? You just saw that? I'd be back there like, all right, Jesus, you just keep on saying your words and knocking them all back, and I'm going to be back here swinging my sword around like I'm doing something, right? That's why he missed and hit a guy's ear. But then, to the disciples' absolute surprise, he makes Peter put his sword away. He heals the man that Peter cut. And then he allows himself to be arrested. And this is when the panic sets in. This is when the process takes a turn that these disciples did not expect. And Matthew 26 says, this is the point when they left Jesus and fled for their lives. And John 18:12 says, so the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And now, at this scene, I can't help but picture the poster for the movie Man of Steel that came out in 2016. 6 years ago, this movie came out, and before the movie was ever seen by anyone, this poster was released as a teaser. And before anyone saw the movie, some bloggers took notice of it, and they posted it. One blogger said, "Is our hero actually a criminal?" Another caption said, "Putting Superman in handcuffs seems a bit silly as new Man of Steel poster arrives." But that's exactly who Jesus is here in this passage. He's Superman in handcuffs. Impossible to take him by force, but he willingly surrenders. And what we're about to see is because he willingly surrendered, in the span of the next about 5.5 hours, Jesus is about to go through 6 different trials. Luke 22:54 very vaguely says, "And they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house." Now, we know from context from other Gospels that really 2 different trials took place here at this time. John 18:13 says, first they led him to Annas, where he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. And here we see trial number 1, Jesus before Annas. Now, a couple of things to note about Annas real quick is that Annas was not the high priest at this time, but he was still referred to as high priest because he had been the high priest before, but he had not held that office for some time. It's kind of like how we still refer to former presidents as Mr. President even whenever they're out of office. But Annas, he's still very much a major player with a lot of influence. First off, he's the father-in-law of the current high priest. And the way this all goes down makes it seem like Annas may not be the face of the operation now, but he's still kind of like the puppet master pulling the strings from behind the scene. Also, he's still very involved in the temple administration. In fact, Annas' main revenue stream came from the temple vendors. Whatever was sold in the temple, Annas got a cut. And you remember what Jesus did to the temple vendors. It was actually the second time Jesus had done this. At the very beginning of Jesus' public ministry, right after he was at the wedding of Cana, did his first miracle, turned the water into wine, he then made his way over to Jerusalem for the Passover celebration. While there, he noticed when he went into the temple that there were vendors who were upcharging people, ripping people off whenever they went to buy their sacrificial animals. So Jesus decides to turn over the tables, even made a whip, and drove all of those vendors out who were ripping people off. Now, 3 years later, it's Passover week again. Jesus comes back into town. He sees the vendors once again doing the same thing, so he does the same thing. He flips the tables and drives them out. So not only is Jesus disrupting temple business, he's hitting Annas, one of the most powerful and influential religious leaders alive, right in the wallet during what was supposed to be the most profitable week of the year. So Annas already has a personal vendetta against Jesus. And before he faces anyone else, Annas wants Jesus brought to him first. And then in verse 19 of John 18, it says, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Now, here is a tactic that many people still use today whenever they try to discount or disprove Jesus. They don't examine Jesus first, himself, all that he is and all that he claims to be. No, first they investigate the people who claim to follow him, find flaws in them, and then use that to discount his teaching. And that argument's never going to go away. Even one of Gandhi's most famous quotes, whenever he was asked what the greatest hindrance to Christianity was, his response was, Christians. And there's truth to that. And we should use that as motivation to be the best, most faithful followers of Christ that we can possibly be. However, no matter how good we try to be, people will always be able to accuse us as followers of Christ as hypocrites. Why? Because we are flawed, broken, sinful human beings trying to represent a perfect, holy God. And whenever we choose to follow Jesus, we don't automatically become completely holy and perfect ourselves. We don't automatically get it all together. No, we spend the rest of our lives in the slow process of maturation where we do everything we can to be a little bit more like him every day. But what sets us apart is the fact that we now have the hope of eternity. Well, one day all of the brokenness and the hurt of this world will one day be wiped away. But at this point, right now, we're not perfect and we're never going to be. But the purpose of our lives is not to be perfect, but to know the perfect one and grow more in him every single day. However, for those who keep Jesus on trial in their lives, whenever they start with his disciples for their opening arguments against him, well, they'll be able to twist that story however they want. Just like Annas was doing. First, he questions Jesus about his disciples. And for example, let's say he used Peter as his argument here. He could have said, so, Jesus, I heard that this Peter is known to be your right-hand man in your close inner circle. And you claim to teach about peace and love and respecting authority, but yet your right-hand man, not 1 hour ago, cuts off a man's ear. Now tell me, what kind of teacher are you that you would breed that kind of violence into your followers? And sure, you can twist the story that way if you start with Peter. But if you start with Jesus, you see him showing a supernatural show of power that no one had seen before whenever they came to arrest him. He then rebukes Peter sharply and then immediately rights Peter's wrong by healing the man. And even though he was powerful enough to knock a mob off their ground by speaking, and even though he was powerful enough and loving enough and caring enough to heal the man's ear, he still allowed himself to be arrested peacefully. The narrative completely changes whenever you start with Jesus. So Jesus answers Annas in verse 20. It says, I have spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I've said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. And when he said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, is that how you answer the high priest? And Jesus answered him, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? And then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. And now we see Jesus being taken off to his second trial. The first one, he was under investigation by Annas, trying to feel out so they could see what accusations they could charge him with. Then he sends him off to trial number 2 before Caiaphas, his son-in-law. And again, Luke doesn't go into specifics here, but Matthew and Mark have details about this trial. In Mark's account, in John 14, we see now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. Now, we are already seeing so many holes in this trial. And if this were to be looked at closely, this whole case would have been thrown out quickly because of all of the judicial rules that they are breaking here. Jesus is in the midst of one of the most unjust trials of all time. The first injustice we see in this is in the timing of the trial. We see that these two trials are taking place in the dead of night. Historians believe that Jesus was taken to Annas at about 2 a.m. He was there for about an hour and a half before he goes off to Caiaphas across the courtyard to be tried by him and a portion of the Sanhedrin that he knew would agree with him. But according to Jewish law, trials could only occur during the day, so the trials could be public and open to scrutiny if needed. And trials were also not allowed to take place during holidays because of their sacredness and all the people traveling. But we know that this trial is taking place right in the middle of the Passover celebration. So the timing of this is all off and completely unlawful. Second injustice we see is in the witnesses that Mark just described. According to Jewish law, all of the witnesses accusing the defense must all agree on every detail of the crime. And if they didn't agree on every detail, the case would be thrown out immediately. But Mark lets us know specifically they couldn't find anyone that could agree, couldn't find any evidence, or couldn't find anyone that wouldn't contradict themselves. Also, according to Jewish law, if the witnesses were found to be lying or contradicting themselves, they were supposed to receive the punishment that the accused was threatened to receive. So if they're accusing them of a punishment that they're supposed to get a death sentence for, if they're found to be false accusations, then the one who gave the false accusation was supposed to be killed instead. It was supposed to deter people from giving false accusations. But instead of following the law, Caiaphas and those gathered just keep trying until they find something they want to hear. And after hours of nothing working, in Matthew's account, he says, and Caiaphas stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Now, this was an intentional move by Caiaphas because by him saying this line, he was putting Jesus now under oath, which means now legally his silence would have been seen as an admission of guilt. So only at this point does Jesus now speak up. And Jesus said to him, "You've said so. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He's uttered blasphemy. What further witness do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" And they answered, "He deserves death." Then the first verse of Matthew 27, it says, they waited until morning when the trial was actually legally supposed to take place. And then they made official what this group had already decided when he says in Matthew 27:1, when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And here we see Jesus' third trial, which is before the Sanhedrin. It takes place at 6 a.m., right at daybreak. They weren't going to waste any time to let the people know what was really going on. And here we see a couple of more injustices in this process. And the third injustice we now see in this trial is in the due process itself. You see, the Sanhedrin was a group of 70 scribes, elders, and priests led by the high priest that served almost as Israel's supreme court. They were the ones that the cases were supposed to be brought to, and then they would judge fairly and impartially. But in this case, they're the ones bringing the case up. So the Sanhedrin here is serving as both the prosecution and the judge at the same time, which is obviously not allowed. Then the fourth injustice we see is in the sentencing itself. According to the Jewish law, the Sanhedrin, they had to have a vote in order to sentence someone to death. And this wasn't an all in favor, say aye type of vote like we see here. It was a vote that was supposed to go one by one, very slowly, starting with the youngest person in the room going to the oldest so that the rookies wouldn't be persuaded by the veterans to vote a certain way. And then the vote had to be unanimous, which we know it was not unanimous because at the end of Luke 23, we see Joseph of Arimathea coming to collect Jesus' body. And Luke says that Joseph was a member of the council. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, a good and righteous man who had not consented to their decision and action. So we don't see a vote. We don't see a unanimous decision. But even if they did get a unanimous decision, At that point, according to the law, if it was determined that someone was to be sentenced to death, that ruling had to sit and not be acted on for 3 days. And during those 3 days, the Sanhedrin would fast and pray to make sure they made the right decision. And also, that would leave more time for further witnesses to come forward that might plead the cause of the accused. And lastly, when the execution was to be carried out, whoever accused the guilty of the crime would have to be the one who carried out the execution themselves. So if you accuse someone of doing a crime that's punishable by death, they get sentenced to death, you then have to be the one that executes them. Again, this was to deter people from making very strong and false accusations. But the Sanhedrin wasn't going to wait 3 days. They definitely weren't going to carry out the execution themselves. Rome would never allow that, and they didn't want that blood on their hands. Instead, they sent him off to his 4th trial before Pilate. So we see that the official Sanhedrin trial should have been a long, dragged-out process, but that didn't last long at all because they went before the Sanhedrin at 6 a.m., and by 6:30, we see him over at the local governor's mansion before Pilate. And then Luke chapter 23, verses 1 and 2 says, "Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, 'We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute or pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king.'" Now, where did that come from? Okay, the 3 previous Jewish trials, they accused him of being guilty of blasphemy. Then out of nowhere, they accused him of telling people not to pay taxes to Caesar, which we know is a lie because earlier they tried to catch him in this and said, "Jesus, what do you say?" Some other people say it's unlawful to pay taxes to Caesar. Jesus says, "Hey, why don't you go get me a coin?" Whose face is on that coin? Caesar's? Well, pay to Caesar what is Caesar's. So this charge, this accusation is a flat-out lie. But they couldn't just bring him to Pilate to be executed for religious reasons. No, they had to have something to make it seem like he was a threat against Rome that would get Pilate's attention. Now, let's get a little background on Pilate real quick. Pilate, he was the Roman governor over the region of Judea at this time, and Pilate's tenure was not off to a very good start. According to history, whenever Pilate was first appointed governor, he made a huge scene of it. He paraded himself through the town. Then he hung up huge banners of Tiberius Caesar, his boss, in the Jewish temple, which the Jews had a big problem with because no one's image was to be put up in the temple, especially not a pagan ruler's. That was utter blasphemy. So the Jewish people protested. Then Pilate agreed to meet with the Jewish leaders in a local amphitheater in order to hear out their concerns. But whenever that meeting started, he then had that amphitheater surrounded with soldiers and threatened to kill them if they didn't get in line. So what did they do? They called his bluff. The story goes that they all laid down on the ground and bore their necks and essentially said, "Do it then." And of course, Pilate relented. Not long after that, Pilate, he was given the task of building an aqueduct in the area, and he didn't want to dip into his own budget to pay for this project, so he decided to raid the Jewish temple and take the funds from there, which of course led to adamant protesting from the Jewish people. And this time, Pilate sends soldiers in common clothes into the mobs of protesters, and at his signal, they took action and beat some of the protesters to death in the streets. And this caused such a commotion that Caesar ended up putting Pilate on an official probation and said if he had one more incident, he would be fired. So, of course, the members of Sanhedrin, Caiaphas, they know this about Pilate, and they're putting Pilate on the spot here, giving him these trumped-up charges. And Pilate, he obviously does not want to get involved. He's already on thin ice. So Pilate, he asked Jesus directly in verses 3 through 5, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered him, "You said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. But they were urgent, saying, "No, he stirs up the people, teaching all throughout Judea. He started in Galilee and came all the way out here to this place." And now Pilate sees his way out. He says, "Hold up, he's from Galilee? Oh, well, that's Herod's jurisdiction. This means this is Herod's problem, not mine." So he sends Jesus off to his 5th trial before Herod. Now, Herod, he was son of Herod the Great, who was the one who had all of the babies in and around Bethlehem killed whenever he heard about the birth of Jesus from the wise men. His son was about just as dark and twisted as he was, because he was the one that had John the Baptist beheaded. He originally arrested him because John called him out for sleeping publicly with his brother's wife. And then to appease his mistress, he had John killed. So this is the Herod that we're dealing with here. Now, Herod, he had heard of Jesus, but he had never actually seen Jesus in person. And verse 8 says, when Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he long desired to see him because he had heard about him and was hoping to see some sign done by him. Now, at first glance, this actually seems promising. We've seen this story before. We've seen the lepers, the blind, the friends of the crippled man, the centurion, the women with the flow of blood, even Zacchaeus. They had all heard about Jesus, heard about the wonderful works he had done. They longed to see him, desired to see him. When they did see him, they were really glad and hoped that he would perform some miracle for them. And each one of those stories ended up with Jesus blessing them beyond their wildest dreams. But verse 9 says, so Herod questioned Jesus at some length, but Jesus made no answer. So what's different here? Why does Herod get the cold shoulder when so many others received their miracle? Well, the biggest difference here is that every other story we've seen that had to do with some level of faith. How many times you heard Jesus say, your faith has saved you, or your faith has made you well? But Herod had no faith. He had no intention of ever having any faith. He wanted to be entertained. Charles Spurgeon once said, our Lord Jesus Christ came not into this world to be a performer. He did not leave his glory to earn the wondering approbation of men. And as Herod regarded him as a mere wonder worker and would have turned his court into a theater wherein Jesus should be the chief actor, our Lord very wisely held his peace and did nothing at all. You see, many of us, we only want to come to Jesus based on Herod's standards. First, we want Jesus brought to us at our own convenience. Now, Jesus did come to us first, and that's evident by him being here on the planet in the first place. He is Emmanuel. He is God with us. But there's no such thing as a one-way relationship. And every other aforementioned story involves someone seeking out Jesus themselves in their own way. And Herod, he had every opportunity to seek out Jesus. John the Baptist had witnessed to him multiple times. He knew about the Messiah. He knew who Jesus was. But he could have sent for Jesus. He could have gone to one of his teachings. When rumor was that he was in town, he could have invited Jesus over for a meal, but he showed no interest in connecting with Jesus. And when Jesus was brought to him, he isn't seeking to worship him or have any sort of life change. He simply wants to be entertained. And this is the second way that many of us only want to come to Jesus. And that's if he shows us something that we want to see. But what Herod completely misunderstood is that Jesus never once performed a miracle to put on a show or to save his own skin, which he easily could have done. Jesus only ever worked a miracle out of compassion and care for broken people. Now, Herod was definitely a broken person, but he wasn't broken before God. He thought too much of himself. He fancied himself a king, which he wasn't. He was just as subject to the Romans as everybody else was, but that didn't change how much he thought of himself, allowing himself to stay living in the palace. No, Herod thinks he's a big deal, so Jesus, he gives him nothing but silence. James 4:6 says that God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble, and that could not be more evident here. So Jesus stays silent, not giving Herod anything he was looking for. And verse 10 says, the chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. And Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. And arraying him in splendid clothing, they sent him back to Pilate. Now, no doubt these priests are giving the same charges and accusations that we've been hearing over and over again. And Herod, he wouldn't have really cared much about any of the blasphemy, the taxes, or things like that. But when they said Jesus considered himself a king, now that would have struck a chord with Herod. Because Herod himself, he's a fake king. He's trying all the time to prove to himself and others that he's actually somebody. So he says, oh, you think you're a king? So they mock him. They make fun of him. They probably slap him around a little bit while sarcastically referring to him as your majesty. And then as a practical joke, they dress him up in royal clothes and send him back to Pilate for his final trial. See Jesus' sixth and final trial here again before Pilate. Pilate, he had to be exasperated whenever he sees Jesus being brought back to him. And then in Luke 23, verses 13 through 16, it says, Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, you brought me this man as one who was misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod. That's why he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish him and release him. Now, this punishment was going to be whipping Jesus' back with sharp metal objects specifically designed to grab the skin and rip out the flesh, to the point that most of the times whenever they would do this, by the time they were done, you could see the person's kidney who was being whipped. Surely this would be punishment enough. But they weren't satisfied. Then Pilate has an idea. He says, you know what? There's a tradition that on the Passover day, the Romans will release one Jewish political prisoner back to the people as a show of good faith. So Pilate thinks he's going to turn the tables on them. He gives them a choice. He said, okay. Makes his guys go get the current prisoner and brings him out. He says, all right, I've heard your charges. I've heard your concerns. Let's keep this tradition going. How about this? Here I have Barabbas, a known murderer. Now I can release him to walk among your families and your kids. Or I can release this man that we find completely innocent. It's your choice. Who do you want? But in verse 18, Luke writes, but they all cried out together, away with this man and release to us the murderer. Release to us Barabbas. Pilate, addressing them once more, desired to release Jesus. But they kept shouting, crucify, crucify him. And a third time he said, why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish him and release him. But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified. And their voices prevailed. Other gospels say, for he feared that they were about to riot. He was scared for his job security. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. And most of us remember the rest of the story where Jesus mocked and beaten, whipped to a bloody pulp to the point that he was too weak that he couldn't even carry his own cross. And he's put up, nails driven through his hands and into his feet, and he's hung on that cross. Interestingly, at the precise time that everyone else would have been taking their animals to the temple to be sacrificed for their Passover meals. It was a dark day, literally. But can you imagine being Barabbas on that day? You're woken up at the break of dawn, roughed up by the guards, jerked out of your cell, but you're not surprised. You knew this day was coming for a while now. It's execution day. And you're brought before Pilate in a large crowd. Again, that's not surprising. The Romans loved their public executions. And then you hear Pilate silence the crowd and declare, should I release to you this guilty murderer or this innocent man? If you're Barabbas, you're thinking, what is this, some kind of sick joke? But then to your complete surprise, the people start chanting, we want Barabbas. We want Barabbas. And then the guards come over and grab your wrists and unlock your chains and move it over to this other man. What do you make eye contact? Do you try to figure out who this man is? Do you ask any questions at all? And then you're led down the steps back among the people into the streets. You're free to go. What happens when you're walking around that day? The Romans put the crosses on the most public street sides with the most foot traffic. Do you walk by and look up at that man on that middle cross where you're supposed to be? What do you do now? Where do you go from here? Now, the reality is we don't know what Barabbas did. We don't know where he went from there. But what's really interesting about Barabbas is the meaning of his name. It's so basic. His name consists of two root words, bar, which means son, Abba, which means father. So his name literally means son of a father. And we see the son of the father taking his place. So why involve Barabbas at all in this story? Because he represents basic humanity. We don't see how Barabbas responded because that's not the point. The point isn't how did Barabbas respond. The point is how are you going to respond? Because the curse of sin put you and I on death row. The wages of sin was death. So our sin, our selfishness, our lies, our wrongdoings, no matter how big or little they may seem to us, they put us in chains, bound for an eternity of hopelessness. We are stuck in a straitjacket of sin, just awaiting our sentence. But then, Superman in handcuffs just stands there on the platform in silence and allows your chains to become his chains, allows your sentence to become his sentence, allows your guilt to become his guilt. And he allows you to go free so that you could have the opportunity to live the rest of your days as a child of the Father in heaven, whose very image you were created in. So C.S. Lewis once said, the Son of God became a man to enable men to become sons of God. And now the question is, how are you going to respond to it? Are you going to keep him on trial? Are you going to keep looking at his flawed followers as an excuse? Are you going to wait until he's convenient for you or what you expect him to be? If you were to die today, what would happen? Where would you go? And if you are in this room today and you cannot confidently answer that question, I'm here to tell you that Jesus took your place on that cross so you could have complete assurance of salvation. Would you pray with me, with every head bowed and every eye closed in this moment? If you were thinking about that question, what would happen if you were to die today? Do you know with 100% certainty that you would spend eternity with in heaven, with Jesus and the Father? And if you want to be 100% sure, the Bible makes it very clear. It says, all who call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Paul tells us that if we confess with our mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord and believe in our hearts that God raised him from the dead, we are welcomed into the family of God right now for all of eternity. So very simply, at your seat, if you want to know that you know that you know that you'll spend eternity with him, all you have to do is call out to him. Say, Jesus, I know that you are Lord. I know that you took my place on that cross. And I know that God raised you from the dead so that I could have hope. At this moment, become Lord of my life. I give it all to you. Just pray anything along those lines. Call out to him. Call out to him in your own words. And if you want to further pray with somebody, you can grab one of the Connect cards in the back of your seat. You can check the box, I gave your life to Christ. You can drop it in one of the boxes. You can bring it to me or any one of our worship leaders. But I would encourage you, if you prayed a prayer like that today, do not leave this place without telling someone, I gave my life to Jesus today. Father, thank you so much for who you are. Thank you for taking our place on that cross, taking our guilt. Father, I pray that we would not take it for granted one bit. I pray that we wouldn't be Barabbases that just walk back into the cell after we've been free. I pray that we wouldn't be Barabbases that just walk off into people and don't really think about you unless it's every once in a while. I pray that we would be the Barabbases that would go back and look up at the man on the middle cross where we were supposed to be and allow ourselves to be completely broken before you. And let us live every single day of our lives declaring to others what you did for us, how you saved us, how you took our place, and how you want to do the same thing for the rest of humanity. Thank you so much for who you are. Jesus, we love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.